On 30th June 2023, at 920 Spring Avenue in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, the light in Lynnewood Hall was not chandelier-bright, but a single bare bulb in the grand hall, powered up by a temporary construction cable. A preservation worker in a dust mask and jeans stands on a small stepladder, quietly straightening an empty gilt frame on the wall where a Raphael once hung. The gesture looks domestic, almost fussy, but he is really aligning reference tape for a condition survey photograph. Outside, summer air hums over the overgrown drive. Inside, boot steps echo on cracked marble. On a laptop open on a folding table, a headline from the Philadelphia Inquirer sits frozen. After almost a decade on the market, Lynnewood Hall in Elkins Park has been sold and saved. Daylight through broken panes makes the dust glow like smoke. The mansion has finally been rescued. It has not been made whole. The cost of keeping it standing is only beginning to be counted. The hand leaves the frame slightly off-center. In the late autumn of 1897, on the rolling farmland of Elkins Park, just north of Philadelphia, workers began cutting into a 300-acre tract so that a new limestone facade could rise above the valley. Streetcar magnate Peter Errol Brown Widener, already one of America's richest men, had commissioned architect Horace Trumbauer to design a 110-room neoclassical mansion, later measured at roughly 110,000 square feet, at what would become 920 Spring Avenue. Widener's fortune came from Philadelphia's streetcar monopoly, from investments in U.S. steel and American tobacco, from partnerships with men like William Elkins and Thomas Ryan, who understood that controlling transit meant controlling cities. By the 1890s, his wealth rivaled that of the Vanderbilts and Astors. But unlike those families with their Newport palaces, Widener chose to build near Philadelphia, close to the networks that generated his money. Construction records and architectural surveys describe a T-shaped house of Indiana limestone, 268 feet long by 215 feet deep, containing 5 art galleries, a ballroom for nearly 1,000 guests, private power plant, carpentry shops, and stables, all set within formal gardens first laid out by head gardener William Kleinheinz. The internal operations of the estate would require a staff of around 100, according to later histories: maids, butlers, gardeners, chauffeurs, grooms. A small town aligned around a single family's name. The construction itself was an industrial operation. Limestone quarried in Indiana traveled by rail to Philadelphia, then by wagon up the gradual slope to the building site. Skilled stonemasons, many brought from Europe, cut and fit each block. Local laborers dug foundations, mixed mortar, hauled materials. The work continued through seasons, through weather, a small army of men building a house for one family. Early exterior photographs held in the Historic American Building Survey show the long processional drive, flanked by clipped lawns and the gatehouse and lodge echoing the main block's classical lines. In these images, the windows are perfectly regular, the stone unblemished, and the building looks less like a house than a statement. That money can turn into permanence. In one interior view from the early 1900s, a housemaid can be seen on a balcony, hand resting on the carved balustrade, just under a massive framed portrait. Later, restoration teams will zoom in on this detail and notice what she is doing. She is lightly dusting the frame's lower edge, a small, routine motion that will echo through the house's future. The photograph captures her mid-gesture, cloth in hand, attention focused on the gilded surface. Her name is not recorded. Her work is. The same frame that once needed daily dusting would, within decades, hang over an empty nail. On 18th of December 1899, Philadelphia newspapers reported on a gala at Lynnewood Hall. 400 guests of Philadelphia and New York society conveyed up the drive in carriages and early automobiles to celebrate the opening of the estate. Inside, the New York Symphony Orchestra and soprano Johanna Gadsky performed under electric chandeliers, while the host, Widener, the former butcher's boy turned traction king, received visitors in a house described as dripping with silk, velvet, and gilded moldings, its rooms lined with Persian rugs and Chinese porcelain. The opening was carefully staged. Guests moved through a sequence of spaces designed to impress: the entrance hall with its marble columns, the grand staircase, the ballroom with its musicians, And finally, the galleries. Even at this early date, Widener's art collection was substantial, though nothing compared to what it would become. As the art collection expanded, the mansion's internal logistics hardened into routine. By the 1910s, according to later accounts, Lynnewood Hall contained one of the last great private U.S. art collections, hung in carefully sequenced rooms: Rembrandt's The Mill, Raphael's Small Cowper Madonna, Bellini's Feast of the Gods, Van Dyck's, Vermeer's, Gainsborough portraits, all arranged by Widener and his son Joseph E. Widener to display both connoisseurship and lineage. The acquisition of each painting was documented in purchase records and dealer correspondence. Widener bought aggressively, paying top prices, outbidding museums and other collectors. He was advised by dealers like Joseph Duveen, who understood that American millionaires wanted not just beauty, but provenance. Paintings that came with royal or noble histories that connected new money to old culture. An internal printed catalog from the 1920s shows floor-by-floor plans of the galleries and notes that viewing was open to the public by appointment from June to October, with benches added and soft music piped in for visitors. Families arriving from Philadelphia would have stepped from trains and early motor cars, walked up the gravel, and entered an environment calibrated for control. Each door, each light switch part of an unseen script. The gallery experience was designed to be both educational and impressive. Visitors were guided through rooms in a specific order, encountering paintings arranged by school and period. Soft classical music played from speakers concealed in the walls, an early form of ambient sound design that influenced later museum practices. Guards stood at discreet distances, ensuring no one touched the frames or got too close to the canvases. Somewhere in the Raphael room, a housekeeper's daily schedule specified dust frames left to right, the same gesture of straightening and wiping that would outlast the art itself. The task was assigned to specific staff members, performed at specific times, inspected by supervisors who checked for fingerprints or missed corners. The frames themselves, often worth thousands of dollars, required as much care as the paintings they enclosed. In printed catalogs, the galleries looked eternal. The paper never showed what happens when a fortune changes hands. By early April 1912, the estate at Elkins Park was running smoothly enough that George Dunton Widener, Peter's eldest son, could leave Lynnewood Hall for Europe. With his wife, Eleanor Elkins Widener, and their son, Harry Elkins Widener, he traveled to Paris to hire a new chef for the family's Philadelphia Ritz-Carlton and for Harry to acquire rare books for the library. The trip was both business and pleasure. George, at 50, was actively involved in managing the family's business interests. Eleanor, daughter of William Elkins, Peter's longtime business partner, moved comfortably in transatlantic society. Harry, 27 and a Harvard graduate, was building his own collection of rare books and manuscripts, focusing on first editions and association copies. The family's connection to transatlantic shipping was not abstract. Through a partnership with J.P. Morgan, P.A.B. Widener held major investments in the International Mercantile Marine Company, owner of the White Star Line, which operated the brand-new RMS Titanic. When George and Eleanor hosted a private dinner aboard Titanic for Captain Edward J. Smith on 14th April 1912, the menu and guest list became part of a web of archival fragments later examined by historians: passenger lists, testimony from the British and American inquiries, fragments of letters. The dinner was held in the a la carte restaurant, a luxurious space separate from the main dining room. The guest list included some of the wealthiest passengers aboard: John Jacob Astor IV and his young wife, Isidore and Ida Strauss, Benjamin Guggenheim. The menu featured oysters, consommé, filet mignon, and elaborate desserts. Captain Smith, who rarely attended private dinners, made an exception for the Wideners. On the night of 14th to 15th April 1912, Titanic struck an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. George, Harry, and their valet did not survive. Eleanor and her maid did. The casualty lists were published days later in newspapers worldwide. George's body was recovered and returned to Philadelphia. Harry's was never found. In Elkins Park, household accounts show no dramatic interruption. Coal was still delivered, horses were still fed, the galleries remained hung. Daily logs would have noted only slight deviations, a canceled dinner party, an unused carriage. But in the family archive, the cablegrams reporting the sinking and the casualty lists began a different kind of record, one in which Lynnewood's scale could not screen out loss. Eleanor Widener would later donate $2 million to Harvard University to build the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library in her son's memory, one of the great research libraries of the world. The money came from the family fortune. The motivation came from a mother's grief. Harvard's library became Harry's monument, but Lynnewood Hall remained the place where his absence was most acutely felt. From that month on, the great house with 55 bedrooms would always have at least 2 rooms that could never be filled again. On 6 November 1915, Peter A.B. Widener died at Lynnewood Hall after 3 years of declining health, as reported in the New York Times obituary under the headline, P.A.B. Widener, Capitalist, Dies. He was 80. The paper emphasized both his fortune, an estate later tallied at over $31 million, and his role as patron of the arts. It mentioned quietly that he had already outlived his eldest son and grandson. The obituary cataloged his achievements, the Philadelphia traction system that made him rich, his partnerships in steel and tobacco, his art collection compared favorably to those of European nobles. It noted his philanthropy, gifts to hospitals, libraries, churches, but also his reputation as a hard bargainer who accumulated wealth through monopoly and political connection as much as innovation. Estate records indicate that ownership of Lynnewood Hall passed to Joseph E. Widener, the surviving son, who chose to maintain the house and art collection rather than break the property apart. In 1916, landscape architect Jacques Graeber was hired to redesign the gardens in a French formal style, adding another layer of order over the terrain. Horses were stabled, kennels built for Joseph's dogs, and during the Second World War, parts of the grounds were used to train military dogs, a wartime repurposing noted in later local histories. Joseph's approach to the estate was different from his father's. Where Peter had built and acquired aggressively, Joseph refined and consolidated. He was more interested in quality than quantity, more willing to open the collection to scholars and the public, more conscious of the collection's historical significance beyond family prestige. Inside the house, Joseph's adjustments were subtle but telling. He refined the galleries, reducing the number of works and separating the collection into 2 distinct sections. And, crucially, he opened them systematically to the public by appointment. Visitor accounts describe chairs and benches set in the rooms with soft music playing through speakers set into the walls, an early form of scripted museum experience. The public viewing program required additional staff, guides who could discuss the paintings intelligently, guards who could manage visitors without being obtrusive, maintenance workers who could clean more frequently to accommodate increased foot traffic. The house was still a private residence, but parts of it now functioned as a semi-public museum, a hybrid that would become increasingly common among great American collections in the interwar period. In one photograph from this period, a footman stands beneath a portrait, hand lifted as if to straighten its edge before a tour arrives. The gesture resembles the maid's earlier dusting, but the motive has shifted. Now it is not just about cleanliness, but about keeping an image of control intact for strangers. The frame must be perfectly level, the painting properly lit, the room arranged to communicate authority and taste. Even before the collection left the house, the galleries were already rehearsing their own absence. By the late 1930s, Lynnewood Hall's public identity had shifted from family seat to art stronghold. A 1941 Time magazine piece, written on the eve of a major gift, described the last great private U.S. art collection hanging on the walls of a chill, pedimented mansion in Elkins Park. The language was clinical, almost forensic. The house was no longer just a residence, but a vault. The Time article appeared as part of broader coverage of American art philanthropy in the early 1940s. With war in Europe threatening museums and collections there, American institutions were positioned to become custodians of Western cultural heritage. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, founded in 1937 with Andrew Mellon's collection as its core, was actively seeking donations from other major collectors. In those years, Joseph E. Widener assumed full stewardship of the art. He was quoted later as saying, "Art belongs to those who appreciate it, others merely own it," a line preserved in National Gallery of Art publications. Behind that sentence lay years of negotiation with federal officials and museum curators. Joseph had no direct heirs. The question of what would happen to the collection after his death was becoming urgent. Between 1940 and 1942, Joseph arranged to donate more than 2,000 works, including some 600 paintings and countless decorative pieces, from Lynnewood to the fledgling National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Transport manifests and insurance documents show the scale. Crates labeled with names like Raphael, Rembrandt, Bellini, leaving the private rail sidings near Philadelphia and arriving under federal guard in Washington. The logistics were extraordinary. Each painting had to be carefully removed from its frame, examined for condition, wrapped in protective materials, crated and transported. Insurance valuations ran into millions of dollars. Armed guards accompanied the shipments. Curators from the National Gallery came to Lynnewood Hall to supervise the packing, ensuring that nothing was damaged in transit. Curators later noted that Joseph insisted the gallery in Washington hang the paintings in the same order and style as they had been displayed at Lynnewood. The operational logic of the house, sequence, sightlines, framing, was being exported, even as the rooms that created that logic were being emptied. The National Gallery's Widener galleries opened with the paintings arranged almost exactly as they had been in Elkins Park, a tribute to Joseph's vision and a ghost of the house that had held them. Somewhere in the stripped Raphael room, a staff member straightened a now empty frame that had been left behind, then removed it from its hook. The daily gesture of adjusting pictures no longer protected glory. It was now a way of saying goodbye. The room's walls showed rectangular patches where paintings had hung for decades, protecting the silk wall covering from light and dust. The ghosts of Raphaels and Rembrandts marked the walls more clearly than any label. By the time the gallery doors opened in Washington, the walls that had taught Americans how to look at these paintings were already going bare. In 1943, shortly after Joseph's death on 26 October 1943 at Lynnewood Hall, the southern part of the estate was sold off for development. Deeds and subdivision plans filed in Montgomery County show long driveways cut into the former parkland and street grids imposed where carriage paths had once wound through the grounds. Joseph's death marked the end of the Widener era at Lynnewood Hall. He had never married, had no children, and had devoted much of his later life to managing the art collection that he ultimately gave to the nation. His will made provisions for various bequests, but the house and remaining property were to be sold. By 1944, as noted in later preservation reporting, 4 generations of Wideners had lived at Lynnewood Hall, and then the family let it go. The house, its gardens, and outbuildings were sold to a buyer who hoped to create a Protestant seminary. When that buyer defaulted on his $99,000 mortgage, the property reverted temporarily to the Wideners, an early sign that the building's operating costs were beginning to outstrip any single institution's capacity. The seminary plan was ambitious but underfunded. The buyer envisioned converting the mansion into classrooms and dormitories, using the grounds for recreation and contemplation. But the scale of the building defeated the plan. Heating costs alone were enormous. Maintaining the roof and windows required constant expense. The electrical and plumbing systems needed updating. Within months, it was clear the project would fail. Contemporary aerial photographs show the house still intact, but the surrounding acreage shrinking, its once continuous landscape cut by new property lines. The mansion itself, 110 rooms, 5 galleries, ballroom, indoor pool, remained too big to fail and too costly to keep. Suburban development was spreading north from Philadelphia, and the land around Lynnewood Hall was more valuable for housing lots than as a single estate. Estate appraisals put the value of what was left on site in millions, but without the core art collection, Lynnewood Hall was becoming an empty container. The target was shifting from paintings to real estate, to whatever could be stripped, sold, or mortgaged. The furnishings went to auction in stages: rugs, furniture, decorative objects, anything portable. What remained were the architectural fixtures: mantels, paneling, light fixtures, the bones of the building. On interior walls, nail holes multiplied where frames had been lifted away. Housekeepers still dusted mantels and adjusted the remaining pictures for the benefit of dwindling family use and occasional guests. The small act of straightening a frame had become an attempt to impose order on a house whose purpose was unraveling. Each day, fewer paintings required attention. Each week, more walls stood bare. The next time a large institution signed papers for Lynnewood Hall, it would not come as patrons of art, but as debt-strained administrators. In 1952, title to Lynnewood Hall passed to Faith Theological Seminary, led by Reverend Carl McIntyre, a Bible Presbyterian figure whose organization purchased the estate to serve as a theological school. Enrollment records and internal newsletters show that over the next 4 decades, the mansion trained hundreds of ministers and Christian workers. The building was recoded, galleries became classrooms, bedrooms turned into dormitories, and the vast ballroom hosted services and conferences rather than dances. McIntyre was a controversial figure in American Protestantism, a fundamentalist who broke with mainline denominations over theological and political disputes, a militant anti-communist who used radio broadcasts to spread his message. Faith Theological Seminary was his educational institution, training ministers in his theological tradition. Lynnewood Hall gave the seminary physical presence and institutional legitimacy. But the scale of the house did not change. Heating oil orders, roof repair invoices, and insurance payments mounted. As the seminary's finances deteriorated, administrators began to dismantle parts of the interior to raise funds. Later accounts and auction catalogs describe mantels, walnut paneling, chandeliers, and even whole architectural elements removed and sold. The extraction was systematic and devastating. Mantels that had been carved by Italian craftsmen in the 1890s were unbolted from walls and sold to antique dealers. Walnut paneling was removed in sections and shipped to buyers across the country. Light fixtures, hardware, even bathroom fixtures were salvaged and sold. What had been a coherent artistic whole was being reduced to inventory. In photographs from the 1970s and 1980s, one can see the marks of this quiet extraction, outlines on walls where paintings once hung, fireplaces with missing surrounds, rooms where paneling abruptly terminates at a doorway. The process had the calmness of routine. A crew unbolting a mantel here, a crate being loaded there. But with every removal, the building's ability to tell its own story weakened. Seminary bulletins from these years often juxtapose appeals for funds with images of the mansion's grandeur. One caption reads simply, "Lynnewood Hall, a resource," another, "Use it or lose it." The house had become both campus and collateral, valued more for what could be extracted than for what it represented as a whole. Students lived in dormitory rooms carved out of former bedrooms. They studied in classrooms that had once been drawing rooms. They ate in a dining hall created from part of the ballroom. The building still functioned, but its original purpose, to house a family and display a collection, had been completely erased. What remained was a shell, increasingly hollow as pieces were sold off. Somewhere in a corridor, a maintenance worker rehung a framed Bible verse in a space where a Renaissance portrait had once been, straightening it by instinct. The gesture was still the same. The theology and economics behind the wall had changed completely. The frame held different content now, but the human impulse to keep it level persisted. By the late 1980s, the most valuable objects leaving Lynnewood Hall were not students with diplomas, but the house's own bones. In 1996, after years of financial strain, Faith Theological Seminary sold Lynnewood Hall at a sheriff's sale to the First Korean Church of New York, a Presbyterian-affiliated church with connections to the seminary. The new owner, led by Reverend Richard S. Yoon in later property records, hoped to revive the site as a religious and educational center. The purchase price was reported at approximately $500,000, a fraction of the building's theoretical value, but reflective of the massive deferred maintenance and renovation costs any new owner would face. The First Korean Church had ambitious plans. They envisioned using the mansion for worship services, religious education, conferences, and possibly a seminary of their own. Zoning records and court documents, notably First Korean Church of New York vs. Cheltenham Township, Zoning Hearing Board, and related tax cases, reveal a decade of conflict between the church and local authorities over how the property could be used and whether it qualified for tax exemption. In 2006, Pennsylvania's Commonwealth Court affirmed that the property had not been demonstrably used for religious or educational purposes in years, undermining the church's claims. The legal battles were complex and bitter. The church argued that they intended to use the property for religious purposes and should therefore be exempt from property taxes. The township argued that intentions weren't enough, actual use mattered, and the property was essentially vacant. The court sided with the township, leaving the church with substantial tax bills it couldn't pay. During this period, Lynnewood Hall slid further into physical decline. Township reports and local journalism describe leaking roofs, broken windows, and unsecured entrances. To raise funds, the church continued selling off remaining assets, including the major Henri Léon Graber fountain, auctioned in 2006 and later documented in Bonham's catalogs. The fountain, a significant work of early 20th century garden sculpture, brought $385,000 at auction, money the church desperately needed but which barely made a dent in their debts. Meanwhile, most of the 110 rooms remained dark. A handful of light bulbs, some plugged into improvised circuits, lit only the areas needed for security checks and legal inspections. The building's electrical system was failing, its plumbing compromised, its roof leaking in dozens of places. Each rainstorm caused more damage, each winter freeze cracked more pipes. On one of these walkthroughs, a church representative is photographed standing in a once grand hall, reaching up to straighten a lone-framed certificate on a wall otherwise stripped bare. The act seems automatic, but in context it reads like denial, a reflex of order against a background of loss. The frame is crooked because the wall itself is warping with water damage. Straightening it changes nothing, but the gesture persists. By the time the lawsuits were settled, the house was winning on one front and losing on every other. It was still standing, but almost empty. From roughly 2010 to 2019, as documented by blogs like Abandoned Southeast and local photography projects, Lynnewood Hall became an unofficial destination for urban explorers. With the mansion effectively vacant and official use stalled, images began circulating online of vast decaying rooms, plaster peeling from ceilings, water stains spreading across frescoed walls, and staircases thick with dust. These photographs, often taken in low light with long exposures, captured details that previous eras had ignored. Fallen fragments of plaster, warped floorboards, the imprint of removed frames like ghosts on the walls. In some shots, a small crooked nail is visible where a great painting once hung. Explorers, more archivists than vandals, frequently mentioned in captions that they moved nothing, that their only intervention was to document. The urban exploration community approached Lynnewood Hall with unusual reverence. Unlike many abandoned sites that attracted vandals and thieves, Lynnewood's explorers seemed aware they were documenting something historically significant. Their photographs became an accidental archive, recording the building's condition in detail at a moment when no official entity was paying attention. At least one widely shared sequence shows a hallway where a gilt frame, stripped of canvas, still hangs. In the first shot, it is canted slightly. In the second, taken on a return visit months later, someone, another explorer, a security contractor, a caretaker, has straightened it. The small correction suggests that even in decay, people felt compelled to tidy the house's wounds. The gesture was anonymous and probably unconscious. Someone walking through saw the crooked frame, reached up, adjusted it. The action took seconds, but it revealed something about how the building affected people. Even in ruin, Lynnewood Hall commanded a kind of respect, a sense that it deserved care, even when no one was paying for that care. Local press described Lynnewood Hall as the largest abandoned mansion in the United States, or a $256 million tragedy house, noting that by 2014, the First Korean Church had quietly listed the estate for sale at $20 million. The asking price would drop repeatedly, first to $16 million, then $12 million, eventually settling around $10 million. Still, no buyers emerged. The combination of deferred maintenance costs and unclear zoning status made the property unattractive to developers and institutions alike. The photographs that circulated online during this period had an unexpected effect. They drew attention from preservationists and historians who realized that Lynnewood Hall, despite its condition, still retained significant architectural integrity. The bones of the building were sound. The damage, while extensive, was mostly cosmetic and mechanical. With enough money and will, the mansion could be saved. The more the house fell apart, the more clearly photographs showed the outline of what had been taken. By 2019, a small group of local historians, architects, and advocates, some of whom had been tracking Lynnewood Hall for years, began working in a more coordinated way to prevent the property's demolition or piecemeal sale. Their efforts eventually coalesced into the Lynnewood Hall Preservation Foundation, LHPF, formally launched in 2022 with the explicit mission to acquire and restore the estate. The foundation's formation was the work of dedicated individuals who saw Lynnewood Hall not as a lost cause, but as a rescue opportunity. Edward T. Tome, who would become the foundation's executive director, had first encountered the mansion as an 11-year-old and had never forgotten it. His childhood fascination matured into professional commitment, and he became the driving force behind the preservation effort. Articles in Hidden City, Philadelphia, and other outlets framed the house not just as a curiosity, but as a test case for Gilded Age preservation. One July 2022 report noted that Lynnewood Hall remained the home of 4 generations of Wideners until 1944, and that the new foundation aimed to reverse decades of deferred maintenance and loss. The rhetoric emphasized Lynnewood as a piece of American cultural heritage that deserved saving, comparable to other great houses that had been successfully preserved. Before they owned the property, foundation members negotiated with the church owner to install security cameras, patch broken windows, and begin basic cleanup. This was quiet operational work. Temporary lighting circuits run through long corridors, tarps placed under leaks, plywood carefully fitted to protect glass. Volunteers spent weekends clearing debris, documenting conditions, and preventing further deterioration. The foundation faced skepticism from many quarters. Local officials questioned whether another preservation group could succeed where institutions had failed. Potential donors wondered if the building was too far gone. Critics suggested the money would be better spent on other historic sites in better condition. But the foundation persisted, building support piece by piece. In one early photograph released by the foundation, Executive Director Edward T. Tome stands in a gallery holding a clipboard, head tilted toward a cracking ceiling. Behind him, on the wall, a frame with no painting hangs crooked. His hand, mid-gesture, is reaching toward it to check the plaster behind, to align it for a photo, or simply out of habit. The image captures the dual nature of preservation work, part technical assessment, part emotional connection. Tome isn't just documenting damage, he's relating to the building as something that matters, something worth saving. The crooked frame bothers him not because it affects function, but because it represents disorder in a place that once embodied perfect order. The house had become an operation again, not a social or religious project, but a long campaign to slow decay and assemble enough capital and political will to change its trajectory. Foundation members gave tours to potential donors, met with politicians, applied for grants, and gradually built a coalition of support. Before any stone could be restored, someone had to decide which absences were still reversible. On 30th of June 2023, after nearly a decade on and off the market, the Lynnewood Hall Preservation Foundation closed on the purchase of the mansion from the First Korean Church of New York. Local outlets in Philadelphia Magazine reported that the sale, funded in large part by a $9.5 million contribution from board chair Scott Bentley and his wife Susan, marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The purchase was the culmination of years of fundraising, negotiation, and planning. The Bentley's contribution was transformative. Without it, the foundation could not have moved forward, but it also represented a broader shift in how historic preservation was being funded in the 21st century, through private philanthropy rather than public investment, through passionate individuals rather than government programs. Coverage in the Philadelphia Inquirer and other media used phrases like sold and saved and emphasized the building's scale, 110 rooms, 32 bedrooms, 28 bathrooms, and its titanic connected past. Preservation groups framed the purchase as a victory for long-term planning over short-term extraction. The alternative, demolition or continued decay, had been very real. Foundation statements outlined a phased strategy: stabilize the structure, restore key interiors, open the gardens to the public as a park, and ultimately program the building as a cultural and educational site. Work logs from late 2023 and 2024 show contractors addressing roof leaks, securing stair railings, and upgrading electrical service, the unglamorous but essential groundwork for any future grandeur. The daily routines inside the house shifted again. Instead of seminary students or lonely church caretakers, there were now preservation carpenters, conservation architects, and volunteers with clipboards. The same corridors that had once carried tithed donations and later legal summons now carried moisture meters and infrared cameras. The building was once again the subject of intense professional attention. Restoration work required difficult decisions. Which era should be privileged in restoration? The Widener period was most historically significant, but almost all the original furnishings were gone. Should missing elements be reproduced? Should damage be repaired invisibly or left partially visible to acknowledge the building's history of loss? These questions had no easy answers. In one widely shared Instagram post from the foundation, a volunteer is shown dusting a surviving frame in a gallery, carefully cleaning its carved surface in preparation for documentation. The caption reads simply, "Step by step." The image is humble, a person with a cloth, a frame on a wall, but it represents something larger, the return of care to a building that had been neglected for decades. The gesture closes a circle that began with a maid's hand in the early 1900s. The difference is not in the cloth or the motion, but in what is missing from inside the frame. Where once there was a Raphael, now there's absence. The frame has been preserved. The painting it protected is in the National Gallery. The separation is permanent, but the frame remains, a reminder of what the house once held. The house had finally found owners who wanted to keep it, but they inherited walls shaped more by what had left than by what remained. By 2024 to 2025, Lynnewood Hall was appearing in a different kind of media: preservation magazines, architectural conferences, and even a music video shot on site by the band The Menzingers, whose song, "Come On Heartache," used the mansion's empty rooms as a visual metaphor for loss. In 2024, the estate hosted the Philadelphia Beaux-Arts Ball, a deliberate echo of its Gilded Age social past, now carefully documented as part of its revival. The Menzingers' video was particularly striking. The band, from nearby Scranton, had grown up hearing about Lynnewood Hall's decay. Their video treated the empty mansion with respect, using its spaces to explore themes of memory and abandonment. The camera lingered on architectural details, moldings, mantels, empty frame hooks, letting the building itself tell the story. At the same time, the property's listing on the National Register of Historic Places in 2025 formalized its status as a site of national significance. Official nomination forms cataloged not just dimensions and styles, but the layered history of ownership, from Widener to seminary to Korean church to Preservation Foundation. The listing provided some legal protection against demolition and qualified the property for certain tax credits and grants. Inside, restoration crews began test patches of paint, plaster consolidation, and window repair. Conservation notes describe flaking gilding on surviving frames, buckling parquet, and water damage on gallery ceilings. Every intervention required a decision: which era to privilege, which scars to leave visible. Modern conservation practice increasingly favors revealing rather than concealing a building's history, acknowledging that the damage is part of the story. The psychological center of the story shifted as well. For the foundation's staff, many of whom had first seen Lynnewood Hall as an unreachable ruin, the act of walking through its halls with keys in hand carried a weight of responsibility. Interviews with Executive Director Edward Tome emphasized not triumph, but stewardship, an awareness that any new script they write into the building must acknowledge the cost of its earlier scripts. Tome and his colleagues understood that Lynnewood Hall could not be restored to its 1912 glory. The art was gone, the fortune was gone, the family was gone. What could be preserved was the building itself as an artifact of American Gilded Age ambition and as a cautionary tale about the fragility of private cultural monuments. The house would need to earn its keep through admission fees, events, and educational programming, becoming essentially what Joseph Widener had begun to make it in the 1930s, a public institution. On some mornings, as workers move through, someone still pauses to straighten one of the surviving frames out of habit. In the daily log, it's just another note under gallery prep. In the longer history, it's a gesture that has shifted from displaying power to acknowledging its aftermath. The mansion's future now depends on whether it can tell its own dark story clearly enough to justify the effort to keep it alive. On a cool evening in late 2025, with the last crew gone for the day, Lynnewood Hall is almost quiet. A motion sensor clicks in one of the galleries, a small security camera, installed years earlier by volunteers working with the then owner, now replaced with a modern system, tracks a faint change in light. In the long hall off the former Raphael room, scaffolding stands where plaster repair is in progress. Work lights are off. There's no art on the walls, only a series of patched rectangles where canvases once hung and a single empty gilt frame, cleaned but deliberately left without a painting, aligned at eye level. Its surface shows traces of all the hands that have kept adjusting it: maid, curator, seminary worker, urban explorer, preservationist. The frame is 4 feet tall, 3 feet wide, carved wood covered in gold leaf. It was made in Italy in the late 19th century, purchased to display a Raphael that now hangs in Washington's National Gallery. The painting and frame were separated in the 1940s. The painting is climate-controlled, insured for millions, viewed by thousands daily. The frame stayed at Lynnewood Hall, first hung with other art, then hung empty, then removed, then found in a basement, then cleaned and rehung as a memorial to what was lost. Outside, car headlights from Ashbourne Road briefly sweep the facades before moving on, a reminder that the world around the estate has changed entirely since 1899. Inside, the only sounds are the faint hum of dehumidifiers and the soft tick of a temporary thermostat relay on the wall. In one of the last lines of a National Park Service summary prepared for the Register listing, Lynnewood Hall is described as a true architectural masterpiece whose story encompasses the rise of American industrial wealth, the formation of a national art canon, the evolution of religious education, and the challenges of large-scale preservation. The frame in the hallway is straight now. There's nothing inside it, only the pale imprint of what used to be protected there. The camera red light blinks once, recording an image of an empty rectangle in a room that once held the last great private art collection in the United States. And then the house goes back to its usual sound, the low, steady creak of a very large structure still deciding, day by day, not to fall.